So one of my go-to fantasy baseball podcasts, they were going through this exercise among the three hosts. And this exercise is intended to help each of us, the listener, make informed decisions about our teams. And so they were doing this exercise where they compared two players, and then they asked each other who would they rather stash on their bench, Shane Bieber or Mick Abel. That's what I said. Yeah, for me, it's Mick Abel. Thank you. I've never been a big Shane Bieber believer. So back and forth they go with their caveats until one of them says, gun to your head, you have to choose, who would you take? Granted, I don't know why someone would put a gun to your head about this question, but which one would you take? And then the other guy banters back and he says, there has been a great societal collapse, if that is the situation I'm finding myself in. And it was funny, and I thought it was a good recalibration to poke fun at themselves and the implied violence of that turn phrase. Putting a gun to someone's head as a way to pressure them into making a decision. I want to name up front this morning that our text has implied violence. That's not a trigger warning, and how's that for another casually violent idiom? But it's important to acknowledge that this violence is there because the overarching narrative about the Israelites will soon move into lots of violence in the coming books. And I want to caution us today and in the future about simply saying something like, well, I believe in the New Testament God of love and not the Old Testament God of violence. And I understand that sentiment. I used it at some point myself. But we do have to be careful with that language and belief because it ends up unintentionally being anti-Jewish. Not anti-Semitic, but anti-Jewish, because we are dismissing an entire sacred text of an entire religion of our siblings in faith when we say we don't believe in that God of violence in the Old Testament. If the Jewish people have found faithful ways to interpret these kinds of difficult stories within the framework of a God of love and justice, then I have faith that we Christians can do that same work. So I want to say now what I'll likely repeat in some of these future stories, that most Jewish and Christian scholars don't read the stories that are violent in these scriptures as divinely sanctioned war. Remember, these are stories and books written by human beings who are doing their best to understand God in their time and place, but they're also trying to communicate theology. But it is all being written in a different time and place than we are in today, where we know nothing at all about a violent culture or wars being justified in the name of God. If only that were the truth, based solely on our usage of casually violent idioms like I used a minute ago, put a gun to your head, or trigger warning, or killing two birds with one stone, I'll shoot you an email. You can imagine hearing those. Either we have no issue with violence at all any longer in our culture, or we have such an issue that we've become desensitized to the horrors of rampant violence all around us. One of the most impactful books I've read this decade was written by scholar Mayang Tran in her book, Reset the Heart, Unlearning Violence, Relearning Hope. She explores why, in her words, it's, quote, as if our collective moral consciousness has once again been anesthetized, and the hope for which church folk love to sing and pray has suddenly been debilitated in the face of actual struggle. It's one of those books that I've highlighted to the point it's no longer useful to highlight. But yet I commend it highly to each of you, and I wish I could just read it for the next few weeks as our sermon. Most pertinent to our text this morning are two key points I want us to hold on to. The first is that violence is learned. She quotes numerous scholars in several fields who have shown that violence is actually learned. And not only that, but to the point of her book, that if violence is learned, then it means violence is taught. Holding on to this reality leads to the second piece for us this morning, what she calls the disimagination machine. She borrows the phrase from someone else, a French author that I couldn't pronounce properly, but if you want, you can see it in the footnotes later. So she borrows this phrase from him, and she goes to great lengths to explain it. Distilled, it boils down to this, quote, "A politics of disimagination has emerged in which stories, images, institutions, discourses, and other modes of representation are undermining our capacity to bear witness to a different and critical sense of remembering, agency, ethics, and collective resistance." That was a lot. So elsewhere, there's this quote: the disimagination machine employs, quote, "a potent and stealthy miseducative power. This machine distorts the long arc of historical memory. It suffocates critical thinking and critical self-reflection. It paralyzes difficult, dissenting, and divergent dialogue. It chips away at moral courage and social agency. It debilitates strategies of resistance, thereby snuffing out possibilities for hope." Thereby snuffing out possibilities for hope. Latran explains how we see this in the violence of racism. The death of Michael Brown in Ferguson was a big anchor for her in this writing. She gives scores of other examples, too, in all of the isms: racism, sexism, ableism, ageism, and all the phobias: xenophobia, homophobia, transphobia. You get the point. It's a concept, this idea of the disimagination machine, that I have not been able to shake ever since I read it. I can't unsee it either in the culture in which we live. Far from removed from the kinds of violence we read in the Bible, we seem to be motivated to find newer ways of doing the same kinds of things. Justifying discrimination in the name of theology, waging wars in the name of God, trying not to feed or house or protect the most vulnerable in our society, refusing to give shelter to those fleeing other forms of violence, in itself a form of violence against them. And the cherry on top, we like to host brutal fights on the lawn of the White House in celebration of 250 years of freedom from the very kind of men who led with brutality and attempted to exert maximum control and to extract complete submission. Friends, the disimagination machine is whirring. And we are, some of us, victims, and many of us participants in it, whether we mean to be or not. Because that's what it does. That's what it's trying to do. It anesthetizes and makes amnesiacs of us, such that the stories and values of our faith become secondary, tertiary, unremarkable at all, in the face of what seems to be the inevitability of society's whims. In our text today, we see examples of some of this disimagination machinery at work. You see it in the people's doubts that they can win against the giants in the land before them. It's also evident, I think, in the response of Caleb and later Joshua, where they believe they can win by going to war. It's framed as if they are having faith in God and the people are doubting. But it's a belief that God is with them, yes, but their answer is one of divine conquest. Both responses, I posit, are symptoms of the disimagination machine, because they misrecognize that violence is the only solution. Pull those quotes I read to you a moment ago about the disimagination machine, and you can see both of the responses in our text line up beautifully with them. The erasure of memory, misremembering their identity, suffocating their critical thinking. But beyond the characters within this story, the authors and redactors of these stories have a role to play too. And they are, I think, practicing a prophetic, sacred imagination here. You know this well by now, I hope. And I can't wait for the day when you all can say this back to me instead. But it's important that we keep reminding ourselves the context in which this story, in which these authors are writing. They are writing centuries after the story is supposed to have taken place. During a time when they and the Jewish people are living in captivity under the Babylonians. They've just lost a devastating war. The temple has been destroyed. They were marched almost 1,000 miles away from their homeland. They're living in a foreign land with foreign gods and a completely different nationalist identity. And the people are forced to reckon with their theology. So the faith leaders do something remarkable. We've talked about it before, but instead of assimilating into the dominant culture of their oppressors, they tell the people to resist. And then they reimagine their familiar stories in ways that help them to reinterpret God in light of their current reality. So a God that they come to believe who didn't die in the rubble of the temple in Jerusalem, but who is alive and active and mobile. A God who was somehow yet with them, even though they're in a foreign land and under captivity. Even though they feel helpless and tiny in comparison to the giant forces of oppression and assimilation. With that context in mind, look again at how potent this narrative becomes. God just delivered the people from slavery in Egypt, as the story goes. And now they're wandering seemingly aimlessly in a wilderness, following around this same God who is alive and active and mobile. You can see it all. It translates perfectly, beautifully with where they are in Babylon. What better way to speak to the Jews living in the wilderness that is Babylonian captivity, up against formidable giants like the Babylonians, as a frightened, doubting people who feel like mere grasshoppers in comparison. These kinds of stories, this story would speak to them. And the author is saying, as reasonable as it is to feel the way the people in the story do, that they're just grasshoppers up against giants, the authors are saying, don't think like that. Don't let the disimagination machinery of your oppressors get you down. Don't let it erase your memories or make you forget your identity. Don't allow yourselves to be brainwashed and become disbelieving and cynical and apathetic. Don't misremember God or misrecognize what is possible. Of course, there's a message here for a displaced people who yearn and hope for a return to their land physically. But I wonder if maybe even more importantly is this clarion call to remember. To remember God's promises, God's character, God's blessing that we read a few weeks ago that comes at the beginning of the book of Numbers, that I think can be a lens for all of the book of Numbers. May the Lord bless you and keep you. May God's face shine upon you and be gracious to you. May God lift up God's countenance upon you and give you peace. Even if the Israelites in the wilderness forgot it in the story, the authors are daring the audience to remember that God is yet blessing them in keeping them, challenging them to remember, to believe, to imagine this God who is still alive and active and on the move. Because if it is truly possible that God wasn't defeated in war, and if it is actually possible that God is somehow with them in captivity or the wilderness or in the shadow of giants, then the real message becomes that another way is always possible with God. The message isn't about divine conquest or sacrifice, violence. It's a call to remember. And it's a message for us today, too, as the audience. It's what we need to hear in our time and place, that we must never forget our faith story, that we must never let go of our Christian calling, that we must always resist the forces of disimagination and deformed theologies of violence and greed and retribution, that we must keep engaging in practices of sacred imagination, because even in the face of poverty, racism, homophobia, all the isms and phobias, even in the shadows of rising authoritarianism and gun violence and rampant corruption of our institutions and collective morality, even up against the very real existence of giants like the world's first trillionaire, or climate change, or a war-ravaged world, we must keep engaging in practices of sacred and prophetic imagination, because it helps us to remember together another way is always possible with God. If you don't know what I mean by sacred imagination, that's okay. I think it's meant to be a starting point. But maybe a few examples to help you. By no means is this exhaustive, but these are things that help us envision an alternative future than what we have seen or been told is inevitable. That's the goal of sacred imagination. So worship, you being here, is a crucial example, even if it feels inconsequential to the scope and status of the world. Because gathering together is an act of creation every single week. Every single week we reenact the story and love of God and engage in acts of co-creating with God in music, in sermons, in prayer. It's a training ground for our imaginations. Prayer is the same way. When we pray, as Walter Wink noted, we are literally envisioning in our minds an alternative outcome than what seems inevitable. If someone is sick, we're praying that they get better. We're imagining, envisioning an alternative outcome than what seems inevitable. Learning and remembering the stories of our faith. We might not agree on every last detail that we read or that we're told, or even each and every way that it can be interpreted. But the wrestling itself keeps us spiritually nimble and cognitively flexible. And those are some of the strongest bulwarks against disimagination. Those things like curiosity, hearing other perspectives, having friends. Stories themselves fortify our hope within resilience and belonging and community. You could go on and on, helping others in acts of service or working for justice. These are all prime ways we fight against disimagination, because we're actively exposing ourselves to the truth. And to the truth of people's experiences and their stories and their circumstances. And together with them, we can imagine and work toward a different future. But if those are too broad or abstract, maybe you need a couple colorful examples. Like what happens in Jacksonville, Florida every year now, since 2020, when the legislature started limiting municipalities' freedoms to celebrate LGBTQ lives by banning the lighting of bridges with rainbow lights, only allowing red, white, and blue lights. The city's pride leaders started a new event. And now every year, during Pride, everybody brings their own flashlights of different colors. And together they march over that bridge that they're not allowed to light up. And they hold their flashlights, and they let the light of their literal flashlights shine like rainbows, and the brighter light of their queer identity and collective love outshine whatever bans the state puts on them. Like what happened in Budapest this time last year, when the government had curtailed the freedom of assembly around LGBTQ rights. The former Prime Minister Viktor Orban explicitly said it was meant to stop the annual Pride celebrations in their country. Instead, the mayor resisted. And on Pride Day last year, over 100,000 people showed up. It's an iconic image, if you look it up, of them just swarming this popular bridge. Like what the city of El Paso is doing this year. After their state of Texas outlawed the decorating of roads and sidewalks with the intention of prohibiting rainbow or Black Lives Matter paintings. So in compliance with that law, but facing it down at the same time, the city has begun placing these rainbow cylinders that connect around their city light posts, and they put those up all across the city as a way to show their love and support for the LGBTQ community. On and on it goes, my friends. Not always with the church, actually often without the church. We see countless examples of courage and resilience and creativity and solidarity and love, each one an act of sacred imagination, of actively subverting the disimagination machine. There's one more thing I was thinking about with this scripture. The little animal nerd in me, I wanted to do a deep dive into grasshoppers. Did you know that if we could jump as far as they could, we'd be able to jump the length of a football field? Did you know they have hearing organs on their abdomens? And that's how they hear, because it helps them to hear the vibrations. Did you know that grasshoppers are the same family as locusts? Those pesky pests that destroy crops and that were part of the plague against the Egyptians when the Israelites were freed from slavery. Locusts swarm by the millions, and collectively they can change any environment. They can change any environment they're in. Dear friends, the disimagination machine wants you to think you're a tiny grasshopper. The kingdom of God wants you to imagine something more, something greater, that another way is always possible with God, like a swarm of solidarity and love and belonging that can change any environment, from Budapest to Babylon to Boston and Worcester and FBC Woo. So let us remember then that even when despair and fear and apathy come near, don't worry, friends. Be hoppy.